I still remember the exact weight of the silver tray in my hands when I first understood that words could kill. Not the words themselves, perhaps, but the silence between them, the hidden meanings that lurked beneath ink and parchment like serpents waiting to strike. My name is Rosalind Ashford, and I was 23 years old when I saved the life of the most formidable man in England, a man who had never once looked at me, a man whose heart was said to be as cold as the winter that gripped the moors surrounding his estate. I was nothing to him, less than nothing, a shadow that moved through the corridors of Thornwood Hall, carrying linens and tea services, invisible in the way that all servants are invisible to those born into greatness. But fate, it seems, has little regard for the boundaries that men construct between themselves. And on one frost-laden evening in December of 1812, my invisible life collided with his in a way that neither of us could have anticipated. I must tell you how I came to be at Thornwood Hall, for without understanding my past, you cannot possibly understand why I did what I did, why I risked everything for a man who did not know my name. My father, Thomas Ashford, had been a professor of linguistics at Cambridge, a brilliant man whose mind danced across languages the way other men's fingers dance across pianoforte keys. He taught me everything he knew, not because he wished for me to become a scholar, for such paths were closed to women, but because he believed that knowledge itself was a kind of freedom, the only freedom that could never be taken away. By the time I was 15, I could read Latin, Greek, French, German, and Italian with fluency. I could recognize the patterns of cipher systems used by military commanders across Europe. I could decode messages that would have taken trained cryptographers days to unravel. But knowledge, I learned, could also be a curse. My father's downfall came swiftly and without mercy. He had been accused of sharing military secrets with foreign agents, a charge that was entirely false but impossible to disprove. The true culprit, we later learned, was a colleague who had envied my father's position and sought to claim it for himself. But by the time the truth emerged, my father's health had been destroyed by the scandal. He died in disgrace, his name blackened, his family left with nothing but memories and the cold charity of distant relations. My mother followed him to the grave within a year, her heart too broken to continue beating in a world that had treated her husband so cruelly. And I, their only daughter, found myself at the age of 19 with no dowry, no prospects, and no family willing to associate themselves with the daughter of a supposed traitor. It was Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper at Thornwood Hall, who gave me my position. She had known my mother in their youth, before circumstance had separated their paths, and she remembered enough of that friendship to offer me a place among her staff. I became a housemaid, one of 12, and I learned to carry trays without trembling, to light fires without leaving ash on the carpets, to move through rooms as though I were made of air and shadow. For 4 years I served at Thornwood Hall, and for 4 years I kept my head down and my secrets buried. No one knew that the quiet maid who dusted the library shelves could read every book upon them. No one knew that the girl who carried correspondence from the Morning Post could understand the strategic implications of every military dispatch that passed through the general's hands. No one knew, because I made certain of it. Knowledge had destroyed my father. I would not let it destroy me. General Lord Sebastian Harcourt was a legend long before I ever set foot in his household. He had distinguished himself in the Peninsular War with a tactical brilliance that had earned him the admiration of Wellington himself. His campaigns were studied at military academies. His name was spoken with reverence in the halls of Parliament. At 41 years of age, he was considered one of the finest strategic minds England had ever produced. He was also, by all accounts, utterly alone. The solitude that surrounded him was almost palpable, a force field that kept others at bay even when they wished to approach. The servants spoke of it in hushed tones, this invisible barrier that the general maintained between himself and the rest of the world. He was courteous, but never warm, correct, but never familiar, present, but always somehow absent. I learned the story in fragments, pieced together from whispered conversations between the other servants and the occasional indiscretion of the older staff members who had been at Thornwood longer than I had been alive. Lord Harcourt had been engaged once, many years ago, to a young woman named Catherine Fairfax. By all accounts, she had been the only person capable of penetrating the fortress of his reserve, the only one who could make him laugh, who could coax warmth from those cold gray eyes. She had died of fever 3 weeks before their wedding. Since then, Lord Harcourt had thrown himself into his military career with a single-mindedness that bordered on obsession. He had no family to speak of, his parents having died when he was young and his only brother lost at sea. He had no close friends, only colleagues and subordinates who respected him but did not know him. He returned to Thornwood Hall only when military necessity demanded his presence in England, and even then he kept to his study and his correspondence, emerging only for formal dinners and the occasional required appearance at society events. I had seen him perhaps a dozen times in my 4 years of service, always from a distance, always in passing. He was tall, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if it ever softened from its expression of permanent severity. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they seemed to see everything and nothing all at once, cataloging details and dismissing irrelevancies with equal efficiency. His bearing was military to the core, shoulders squared, spine straight, every movement precise and economical. He walked through his own home like a commander surveying a battlefield, assessing potential threats, calculating tactical advantages. Even at rest, there was a coiled energy about him, a sense that he could spring into action at a moment's notice. The staff feared him, though he was never cruel. He simply expected perfection, and those who failed to deliver it found themselves dismissed without ceremony. But there was something beneath the sternness, something I glimpsed occasionally when he did not know he was being observed, a weariness that went bone deep, a loneliness that no amount of military accolades could fill. He never looked at me. Why would he? I was furniture to him, no more notable than the candlesticks I polished or the fireplaces I swept. But I looked at him. God help me, I looked at him more than I should have, more than was proper for a servant, more than was wise for a woman in my position. There was something in him that called to me, something beneath the ice and the discipline that I recognized, though I could not have said why. Perhaps it was loneliness, recognizing loneliness. Perhaps it was the way his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility as though it might crush him at any moment. Perhaps it was simply that my foolish heart had chosen its own path and refused to be deterred by reason. Whatever the cause, I watched him. I noticed the way he rubbed his temples when he had been reading dispatches for too long. I noticed the way his hand would sometimes reach toward the miniature portrait on his desk before pulling back, as though touching it would cause him too much pain. I noticed the way he would stand at the window of his study late at night, staring out at the darkness as though searching for something he knew he would never find. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that I was simply observant, as my father had trained me to be. I told myself that my feelings were an indulgence I could not afford, a fantasy that would only lead to heartbreak. I told myself many things. I believed none of them. The evening that changed everything began like any other December evening at Thornwood Hall. The house was preparing for a formal dinner, one of the rare occasions when Lord Harcourt entertained guests, and the staff had been working since dawn to ensure that everything would be perfect. The guest list was small but distinguished, several high-ranking military officers, a member of Parliament, and their wives. The purpose of the gathering, I had overheard, was to discuss the ongoing war effort and to plan for the spring campaigns that would, God willing, finally bring Napoleon to his knees. The kitchen was in chaos, the cook shouting orders while pots bubbled and hissed on every surface. The footmen moved through the house like well-trained soldiers. polishing silver and arranging flowers and ensuring that every corner of Thornwood Hall gleamed with appropriate grandeur. Mrs. Brennan supervised it all with a general's eye for detail, her ring of keys jangling at her waist as she inspected each room for imperfections. I had my own duties to attend to, smaller and less visible than the others, but no less demanding. I had been assigned to assist with the correspondence that evening, a task that involved collecting any letters or dispatches that arrived during dinner and delivering them to Lord Harcourt's study to await his attention. It was a simple duty, one that required nothing more than the ability to walk quietly and to resist the temptation to read what was not meant for my eyes. The first dispatch arrived at 7:30, delivered by a courier on horseback who looked as though he had ridden through a snowstorm to reach us. I took the sealed envelope from the butler, Mr. Crawford, and carried it to the study, where I placed it on the desk alongside the other correspondence that had accumulated throughout the day. I should have left immediately. That was my duty. After all, to deliver and depart, to remain invisible. But something made me pause. Perhaps it was the red seal on the envelope, the mark of urgent military correspondence. Perhaps it was the way the courier had looked, not merely tired, but frightened, as though he carried death itself in his saddlebag. Or perhaps it was fate, reaching out to change the course of my life. I do not know what possessed me to pick up the envelope. I do not know what madness made me hold it up to the candlelight, examining the seal, the paper, the handwriting of the address. I only know that as I looked at it, something felt wrong. The seal was slightly irregular, the wax a shade darker than the official military red. The handwriting, though competent, had certain tells that suggested it had been copied rather than written naturally. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "Always look beneath the surface, Rosalind. The truth hides in the smallest details." Before I could stop myself, I had broken the seal. The message inside was written in code, a complex cipher that would have been indecipherable to most people. But I was not most people. I was the daughter of Thomas Ashford, and my father had taught me to see patterns where others saw only chaos. I sank into the chair beside the desk, my hands trembling as I worked through the cipher. The technique was familiar, a variation of a visionnaire cipher with multiple key shifts that my father had taught me years ago. The candlelight flickered as I worked, casting dancing shadows across the page, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the muffled sounds of the dinner party continuing without me. My pencil moved across a scrap of paper, jotting down letters, testing combinations, discarding failures, and pursuing leads. It took me only minutes to crack it, minutes that felt like hours, and when I finally understood what the message said, my blood turned to ice in my veins. The message purported to be from General Wellington himself, ordering Lord Harcourt to lead a surprise attack on a French encampment near the Spanish border. The attack was to take place in 3 weeks' time, and Lord Harcourt was to personally command the assault, leading a force of 500 men through a mountain pass that would bring them behind enemy lines. But the message was a lie. The cipher, while sophisticated, contained errors that no military cryptographer would have made. The phrasing was slightly off, using terminology that the French preferred rather than the British. And the mountain pass mentioned in the orders was a death trap, a narrow corridor surrounded by high cliffs that would allow an ambush force to rain destruction down upon anyone foolish enough to enter it. This was not an order from Wellington. This was a trap, carefully constructed to lure Lord Harcourt to his death. My mind raced as I tried to understand who could have done this and why. Lord Harcourt had enemies, certainly, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. There were those who envied his success, those who resented his influence, those who would benefit from his removal. But to orchestrate something of this magnitude required resources, intelligence, and a cold ruthlessness that chilled me to contemplate. And there was something else, something that made my stomach turn with horror. The message had been delivered by what appeared to be an official courier, through what appeared to be official channels. If I had not intercepted it, if I had not recognized the flaws in the cipher, Lord Harcourt would have received it and believed it to be genuine. He would have trusted it because he had no reason not to trust it. He would have ridden to his death, and no one would have known it was murder until it was far too late. I knew what I had to do. I knew also what it would cost me. To reveal what I had discovered would be to reveal how I had discovered it, and that would mean exposing myself, exposing my abilities, exposing the truth I had hidden for so long. Lord Harcourt would demand to know how a simple housemaid could decode military ciphers. He would investigate my background. He would learn about my father, and then I would be dismissed at best. At worst, I would be suspected of complicity in the very conspiracy I was trying to expose. But what choice did I have? What choice could there possibly be when a man's life hung in the balance, when the lives of 500 soldiers depended on someone speaking the truth? I thought of my father, of the accusation that had destroyed him, of the silence that had allowed a lie to flourish while the truth withered and died. I thought of all the things I had not said, all the times I had kept my head down and my mouth closed because it was safer, because it was easier, because it was what was expected of someone like me, and I decided that I was done being silent. The dinner was still in progress when I emerged from the study, the forged dispatch clutched in my hand. I could hear the distant murmur of conversation, the clink of crystal and silver, the polished sounds of aristocratic society engaged in the rituals of power and propriety. I walked toward those sounds with my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain the entire household could hear it. The dining room doors loomed before me like the gates of judgment. I knew that once I passed through them, there would be no going back. I knew that I was about to destroy the careful anonymity I had built over 4 years of service. I knew that I was about to risk everything. I pushed open the doors anyway. The scent hit me first, the mingled aromas of roasted pheasant and candle wax, of expensive perfume and polished silver. The light was softer here than in the corridors, filtered through crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows across the damask tablecloths. Everything gleamed, everything sparkled, everything spoke of wealth and power and a world that had no place for someone like me. The conversation died as I entered. 12 faces turned toward me, their expressions ranging from surprise to irritation to outright horror. A housemaid interrupting a formal dinner, such a thing was simply not done. Mrs. Brennan, who was overseeing the service, went pale and started toward me, her mouth opening to demand an explanation, to order me out, to salvage what could be salvaged of propriety. But I was not looking at Mrs. Brennan. I was looking at Lord Harcourt. He sat at the head of the table, resplendent in his military uniform, his storm-gray eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that made my knees want to buckle. There was no recognition in his gaze, only assessment, the sharp, tactical mind cataloging this unexpected intrusion and calculating its meaning. I walked toward him, ignoring the gasps and murmurs from the other guests, ignoring the hiss of outrage from Mrs. Brennan. I stopped at his side and held out the dispatch. My voice, when I spoke, was steadier than I had any right to expect. "My lord," I said, "this message arrived tonight. It orders you to lead an attack through the Montoya Pass, but it is a forgery. The cipher contains errors that no legitimate military cryptographer would make, and the pass itself is a trap. If you follow these orders, you will lead your men into an ambush. You will die, my lord, and they will die with you." The silence that followed my words was absolute. Every eye in the room was fixed upon me, and I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down upon me like a physical force. Who was this serving girl who dared to address the general directly? Who was this presumptuous creature who claimed to understand military ciphers? Who did she think she was? Lord Harcourt took the dispatch from my hand. His fingers brushed against mine for just a moment, and even in my terror, I felt the shock of that contact like lightning through my veins. He unfolded the paper and examined it, his expression revealing nothing. "How do you know this is a forgery?" His voice was calm, measured, utterly controlled. There was no anger in it, no surprise, only the patient inquiry of a man accustomed to gathering information before reaching conclusions. I swallowed hard. The cipher uses French terminology in 3 places where British military convention would require different phrasing. The seal was pressed with a die that is slightly worn on the lower left quadrant, inconsistent with official military seals, which are replaced at regular intervals. And the paper itself is of continental origin, manufactured in a mill near Lyon, rather than in England. Lord Harcourt's eyebrows rose by the smallest fraction. You determined all of this from a simple examination? Yes, my lord. He regarded me for a long moment, and I felt as though those gray eyes could see straight through to my soul, could read every secret I had ever kept, every fear I had ever harbored. Then he turned to the dispatch and began to study it more carefully, and I watched as his expression shifted from skepticism to surprise, to something that might have been respect. She is correct, he said at last. His voice carried clearly through the silent room. This document is a forgery, and a masterful one at that. Had this young woman not intercepted it, I would have believed it genuine. I would have followed its orders. And I would have led 500 men to their deaths. The weight of his words seemed to press down upon the room. I saw faces pale around the table, saw the military officers exchange glances of alarm and disbelief. The wife of one of the Parliament members pressed a hand to her throat, her eyes wide with horror. One of the military officers, a man with a red face and impressive side whiskers, leaned forward. But how could a housemaid possibly know such things? Surely this must be some kind of trick, some elaborate deception. Lord Harcourt's gaze returned to me. Yes, he said slowly. That is indeed the question, is it not? He rose from his chair, and I was struck again by how tall he was, how commanding his presence. The dinner party can proceed without me. I believe I must have a private conversation with this young woman. He placed his hand on my elbow, a gesture that was both proprietary and oddly gentle, and guided me toward the door. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room following us, could hear the whispers already beginning to ripple through the assembled guests. My reputation, such as it was in ruins. My position in this household was almost certainly forfeit. As we passed through the doorway, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Brennan's face, pale and frightened, her hands clasped tightly before her. She had given me this position out of loyalty to my mother's memory. Now I had repaid that kindness by creating a scandal that would surely reflect upon her judgment. The thought twisted in my chest like a knife. But Lord Harcourt was alive. Whatever came next, at least I had accomplished that. He led me to his study, the very room where I had discovered the truth, and closed the door behind us with a decisive click. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls, illuminating the books and maps and military memorabilia that filled every surface. This was his domain, the place where he planned campaigns and read dispatches and carried the burden of command that seemed determined to crush him. I noticed details I had never allowed myself to observe before. The worn leather of his favorite chair, shaped by years of use. The chess set on the side table, its pieces frozen mid-game as though waiting for an opponent who never came. The miniature portrait on his desk, which I now understood must be Catherine, forever young and beautiful in oils and gold leaf. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. Sit. It was not a request. I sat. Lord Harcourt did not sit. Instead, he paced before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. The firelight caught the silver at his temples and turned it to gold, and I found myself noticing again how handsome he was, how the severity of his features was offset by the intelligence in his eyes. I pushed the thought away. This was not the time for such foolishness. Your name, he said at last. Tell me your name. Rosalind Ashford, my lord. He stopped pacing. Ashford. His voice sharpened with recognition. Any relation to Thomas Ashford, the Cambridge professor? My heart sank. He was my father. Lord Harcourt was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and retrieved a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses. He poured, handed 1 glass to me despite the impropriety of a lord serving a servant, and drank deeply from his own. "I knew your father," he said quietly. "Not well, but we corresponded on several occasions. His work on military ciphers was extraordinary. The War Office consulted him many times during the early years of the conflict with France." I stared at him in astonishment. I had not known this. My father had never mentioned any connection to the military, never spoken of work he might have done for the government. But then, my father had kept many secrets, some of which I was only beginning to understand. I remembered the letters he would receive sometimes, sealed with red wax and bearing no return address. I remembered the nights when he would work late in his study, the door locked, the curtains drawn against prying eyes. I had always assumed he was working on academic papers or personal correspondence. Now I wondered if there had been far more to it than that. "I was saddened to hear of his disgrace," Lord Harcourt continued, "and more saddened when I later learned the truth, that he had been falsely accused, that the real traitor had been another man entirely. But by then it was too late. Your father was dead, and there was nothing I could do to restore his name." There were tears in my eyes now, tears I could not suppress. I had not cried for my father in years, had trained myself to lock away the grief and the anger because dwelling on them would not change anything. But hearing Lord Harcourt speak of him with respect, hearing someone acknowledge the injustice that had been done, broke something loose inside me that I had not known was still there. For so long, I had carried my father's memory in silence, protecting it from the scorn of a world that believed him a traitor. For so long, I had been alone in my certainty of his innocence, unable to share it with anyone for fear of being dismissed, or, worse, suspected of complicity in his supposed crimes. And now, in this room, in the presence of this stern and formidable man, I was finally being seen. Not just my skills with ciphers, but my grief, my loyalty, my love for a father who had deserved so much better than he received. "I did not know," I whispered. "I did not know that anyone remembered him as anything other than a traitor." Lord Harcourt set down his glass and came to stand before me. His expression had softened, though it could hardly be called warm. "Your father was a brilliant man who was destroyed by the jealousy and ambition of lesser men. His legacy should have been honor and recognition. Instead, it was silence and disgrace." He paused. "And yet you carry his legacy within you. You have inherited his gifts. Tonight, you used those gifts to save my life." I could not speak. The tears were falling freely now, and I was mortified by my own weakness, but I could not stop them. Lord Harcourt reached into his pocket and produced a handkerchief, which he pressed into my hand. His fingers lingered against mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "Tell me," he said, "how long have you been hiding what you are? How long have you been pretending to be nothing more than a housemaid when you possess a mind that could rival the finest strategists in England?" I wiped my eyes and struggled to compose myself. 4 years, my lord, since I came to Thornwood Hall. And in all that time, you never once revealed your abilities? You never sought to use them for your own advancement? To what end? I asked bitterly. No one would believe that a woman could possess such skills. And even if they did, they would not trust her with anything of importance. A woman's place is in the home, in the nursery, in the drawing room, not in the War Office. Lord Harcourt's jaw tightened. "You believe that is what I think? That I would dismiss your abilities because of your sex? I do not presume to know what you think, my lord. I only know what I have observed of the world and what I have learned from bitter experience. My father's gifts were not enough to protect him. Mine will not protect me either." He turned away and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. The snow had begun to fall again, soft white flakes drifting past the glass like the ghosts of memories. "You are wrong," he said at last. His voice was strange, rougher than before, as though the words were being dragged from somewhere deep within him. You think that I cannot see your worth because of what you are. But I have spent my entire life surrounded by men of noble birth who possess no more intelligence than the horses they ride. I have watched fools and sycophants rise to positions of power while men of genuine ability are overlooked and ignored. And I have learned to judge people not by their birth or their station, but by their actions and their character. He turned back to face me, and there was something in his eyes that I had never seen before, something that looked almost like vulnerability. Tonight, you saved my life, he continued. You had nothing to gain by doing so and everything to lose. You risked your position, your security, your future, all for the sake of a man who has never even spoken your name. That, Miss Ashford, is worth more to me than all the noble bloodlines in England. I did not know what to say. I had prepared myself for anger, for suspicion, for dismissal. I had not prepared myself for this unexpected recognition, this strange and terrifying intimacy. Lord Harcourt was looking at me as though he truly saw me, not as a servant, not as an inconvenience, but as a person worthy of respect. It was the most wonderful and the most frightening thing that had ever happened to me. My lord, I finally managed. What will happen now? The message, the conspiracy, whoever sent it, they will know that their plan has failed. They may try again. Lord Harcourt nodded grimly. Yes, which is why I need to find them before they can make another attempt. He looked at me with sudden intensity, and I believe I am going to need your help to do it. My help? You deciphered their message. You understood their methods. You know how they think. He stepped closer, and I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, something that made my pulse quicken despite my best efforts to remain composed. I have intelligence officers and cryptographers at my disposal, but none of them noticed what you noticed. None of them would have caught the flaws you caught. You have a gift, Miss Ashford, and I would be a fool not to make use of it. I stared at him in disbelief. You want me to help you find the conspirators? I want you to work with me to unravel this plot and bring those responsible to justice. He paused. It will not be easy. It will not be safe. And it will require you to remain at Thornwood Hall, not as a housemaid, but as he seemed to search for the right word, my consultant. I should have refused. Every instinct of self-preservation I possessed was screaming at me to decline, to return to my invisible life, to forget this night had ever happened. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was not a refusal. Yes, I said. Yes, my lord. I will help you. Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been satisfaction or perhaps relief. Good, he said. We will begin tomorrow. In the meantime, I will have Mrs. Brennan prepare different quarters for you. You can no longer share a room with the other housemaids. Your new position will require, he paused again, privacy. I rose from the chair, my legs unsteady beneath me. My lord, what should I tell the others? What explanation can there possibly be for this? Lord Harcourt regarded me with a faint smile, the first I had ever seen on his stern face. Tell them whatever you wish, or tell them nothing at all. Let them wonder. I find that uncertainty often serves better than explanation. He walked to the door and opened it. Mrs. Brennan will see to your new arrangements. We will meet in the morning to discuss our strategy. I moved toward the door, but as I passed him, he spoke again. Miss Ashford. I turned. Yes, my lord? His gray eyes held mine. Thank you. For what you did tonight. I do not say those words lightly, and I do not say them often. But you have earned them. I felt my cheeks flush with heat. You are welcome, my lord. I pray that I may continue to be of service. I slipped through the door before I could say anything more foolish. Before the tears could return, before the impossible feelings rising in my chest could find their way to my lips. I heard the door close behind me, and I stood alone in the corridor, trembling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. My life would never be the same. I knew that with absolute certainty. But whether it would be better or worse, whether I had just saved myself or damned myself, that I could not begin to predict. I only knew that for the first time in 4 years, someone had seen the real Rosalind Ashford, and that someone was the most dangerous man I had ever met. The following weeks were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Mrs. Brennan, bless her bewildered heart, installed me in a small but comfortable room in the east wing of the house, far from the servants' quarters, but not quite in the family's domain. A compromise, she called it, though I could see in her eyes that she had no idea what to make of my sudden change in circumstances. The room itself was a revelation. I had spent 4 years sharing cramped quarters with 2 other housemaids, sleeping on a narrow bed with a lumpy mattress, waking before dawn to begin my duties. Now I had a room of my own, with a proper bed and a wardrobe and a small writing desk by the window. There was even a fireplace, which the hall boy came to tend each morning without being asked. I did not know how to behave. The habits of servitude were so deeply ingrained in me that I found myself making my own bed, tidying my own room, jumping to attention whenever someone knocked at my door. The adjustment from invisible servant to valued consultant was more difficult than I had anticipated. The other servants were equally confused. Some regarded me with suspicion, convinced that I must have engaged in some impropriety to have captured the general's attention. Others treated me with a wariness that bordered on fear, as though my elevation reminded them of the precariousness of their own positions. Only a few, mostly the older staff who remembered my early years of quiet competence, seemed willing to give me the benefit of the doubt. But I had little time to worry about the opinions of my former colleagues. Lord Harcourt was a demanding taskmaster, and our work consumed nearly every waking hour. He set up a small workspace for me in an anteroom adjacent to his study, a space that had previously been used for storing old maps and documents. The room was transformed overnight, its dusty shelves cleared away and replaced with fresh paper, ink, quills, and all the tools I might need for my work. A comfortable chair was brought from one of the guest rooms. A lamp was installed that burned with the finest whale oil, its light steady and bright, perfect for the detailed work of decoding ciphers. I was touched by these gestures, small as they were. They showed that Lord Harcourt took my contributions seriously, that he valued my work enough to ensure I had the proper conditions in which to do it. No one had ever shown such consideration for my comfort before, except my parents, and they had been dead for years. We met each morning in his study, where he would share whatever intelligence had arrived during the night, and I would analyze it for patterns, inconsistencies, and hidden meanings. I discovered that the forged dispatch had been only the beginning, one thread in a web of deception that stretched across England and beyond. Someone had placed agents throughout the military command structure, someone with access to official channels and official seals, someone who knew enough about military operations to craft convincing forgeries. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. As we pieced together the evidence, we uncovered traces of tampering in dispatches dating back years, supply routes that had been mysteriously compromised, troop movements that had been anticipated by the enemy, intelligence that had found its way into French hands despite every precaution. How many soldiers had died, I wondered, because of these betrayals? How many battles had been lost? How many families had received letters of condolence because someone in a position of trust had chosen gold over honor? The thought filled me with a cold fury that made my hands tremble as I worked. This was not mere espionage. This was murder, slow and systematic and utterly without conscience. Finding them would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to examine every piece of correspondence with the same suspicious eye. Lord Harcourt proved to be an ideal partner in this endeavor. His knowledge of military matters was encyclopedic, and his memory for detail bordered on supernatural. He could recall conversations from decades past with perfect accuracy, could identify handwriting he had seen only once, could trace the provenance of a document through a dozen hands without ever losing the thread. There were moments when I would catch him watching me as I worked, his gray eyes thoughtful and intent. At first, I assumed he was merely monitoring my progress, ensuring that his trust in me was not misplaced. But as the days passed, I began to suspect there was something else in those glances. Something that made my heart race in ways I did not want to examine too closely. We developed a rhythm to our work, an unspoken understanding of when to speak and when to be silent, when to press forward and when to step back and consider. He would bring me tea without being asked, remembering exactly how I liked it. I would remind him to eat when he became so absorbed in a problem that he forgot about meals entirely. It was all perfectly professional, perfectly proper. And yet there was an intimacy to it that frightened me, a closeness that went beyond the mere sharing of secrets. And he listened to me. That was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. When I offered an observation, he considered it seriously. When I proposed a theory, he examined it on its merits rather than dismissing it out of hand. When I made a mistake, as I occasionally did, he corrected me without condescension or mockery. I had never been treated as an intellectual equal before, not since my father's death. The experience was intoxicating. It was also deeply unsettling, because as the days passed and our work drew us closer together, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain the professional distance that propriety demanded. Lord Harcourt was not a warm man by any measure, but there were moments when his guard would slip, when I would catch a glimpse of the person beneath the uniform and the title, and those glimpses affected me more than I cared to admit. I learned that he had a dry wit that emerged only rarely but was devastatingly effective when it did. I learned that he played chess with ruthless brilliance and that he considered losing to be a personal affront. I learned that he had a particular fondness for poetry, especially the works of Shakespeare and Milton, though he would never admit this to his military colleagues. I learned that he had nightmares sometimes, that I could hear him pacing in his chambers late at night when the demons of memory would not let him rest. I learned that he was afraid, not of battle, not of death, but of something far more terrifying, the prospect of caring for someone again, of opening himself to the possibility of loss. He had loved once, deeply and completely, and that love had been taken from him. The walls he had built around his heart were not made of coldness, but of fear, and I understood, because I had built walls of my own. There was an evening, about 2 weeks into our collaboration, when a breakthrough in our investigation left us both elated and exhausted. We had finally identified the courier network that was being used to deliver the forged dispatches, a revelation that had taken days of painstaking analysis and would bring us significantly closer to identifying the mastermind behind the conspiracy. Lord Harcourt had ordered champagne, a gesture that seemed wildly extravagant for a servant and a soldier working in a cold study late at night. But when he handed me a glass and raised his own in a toast, I did not refuse. "To the most remarkable woman I have ever met," he said. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. "My lord, that is surely an exaggeration." "I do not exaggerate." His gray eyes held mine over the rim of his glass. "I have met queens and countesses, diplomats and duchesses. None of them possess a fraction of your intelligence, your courage, or your integrity. You are a wonder, Miss Ashford, and I am grateful every day that fate brought you to my door." I did not know how to respond to such a compliment. I took a sip of champagne to cover my confusion and nearly choked on the bubbles. He laughed then, a genuine laugh that I had never heard from him before, warm and unguarded, and so unexpected that it made my heart ache. And I learned about Catherine. It was nearly a month after my revelation, on a bitter January evening, when the wind howled around the corners of the manor and the fire in the study barely kept the chill at bay. We had been working for hours, poring over a collection of intercepted letters that had yielded nothing of value, and Lord Harcourt had finally called a halt to our efforts. He poured brandy for both of us, a habit he had developed despite my protests that it was not appropriate for a servant to drink with her employer. I had stopped arguing about it. There was no point. Lord Harcourt did as he pleased. "You are not like other women," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between us. I raised an eyebrow. "I should hope not, my lord. Most women would not spend their evenings decoding intercepted correspondence. That is not what I meant." He swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "You do not simper. You do not flatter. You do not pretend to be less intelligent than you are in order to make others feel more comfortable." He looked at me with something like wonder. "How is that possible? How did you escape the training that seems to afflict every other woman in England?" I smiled despite myself. "My father, my lord. He raised me to value truth over comfort, and he never suggested that my mind was any less capable than a man's. I suppose I simply never learned to pretend otherwise. Your father was a remarkable man. He was." I took a sip of brandy, letting the warmth spread through my chest. He was also somewhat of an eccentric. I suspect that many of his colleagues found him difficult to understand. Lord Harcourt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was engaged once, you know." I knew, of course, but I said nothing, sensing that he needed to speak more than he needed to hear. Her name was Catherine. He set down his glass and stared into the fire. She was 22 years old, and she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Not just in appearance, though she was certainly that, but in spirit. She had this light inside her, this joy in living that I had never encountered before and have never encountered since. "What happened?" I asked softly. "Fever." He spoke the word as though it were a curse. "She caught a fever 3 weeks before our wedding. The doctors did everything they could, but it was not enough. I sat by her bedside for 6 days, watching her slip away, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing at all. My heart ached for him. I am so sorry, my lord." He shook his head. "It was a long time ago. 17 years. I should have moved past it by now. Everyone tells me I should have moved past it by now. But she was." He paused, struggling to find the words. "She was the only person who ever truly knew me. The only one who saw through all of this." He gestured at himself, at the uniform and the titles and the reputation, and loved what she found underneath. When she died, I lost the only mirror that showed me who I really was. I did not know what to say. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but I was acutely aware of the boundaries between us. He was a lord, a general, a man of power and position. I was a servant girl who had been elevated beyond her station through a strange twist of fate. Whatever intimacy we had developed through our work, it did not erase the gulf that separated us. And yet, "My lord," I said carefully. "May I speak freely?" "You always speak freely. It is one of the things I appreciate about you." I gathered my courage. "I do not believe that Catherine was the only mirror you will ever have. I believe that somewhere in the world there is someone else who can see you as she did. Perhaps you have not found them yet. Perhaps you have not allowed yourself to look for them. But they exist, and when you are ready, they will be there." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something passed between us that I could not name. A recognition, perhaps, an acknowledgement of what had been growing in the silences between our words, in the accidental touches, in the long hours spent together in this room. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "Rosalind." It was the first time he had used my Christian name. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. "My lord?" He reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm against mine, roughened by years of handling reins and weapons, and yet gentle as he traced his thumb across my palm. "I am not a man who speaks easily of his feelings," he said. "I have spent so long building walls around myself that I am not certain I remember how to tear them down. But I want you to know that these past weeks have been, he struggled for a moment, they have been a gift. Having you here, working beside me, talking to me as an equal rather than as a subordinate, it has reminded me that there is more to life than duty and obligation. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. My lord, I could not seem to form a coherent sentence. You do not need to say anything, he said. I am not asking for anything. I simply wanted you to know. He released my hand and stepped back, and I felt the loss of his touch like a physical pain. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow we begin a new phase of our investigation. He was right, of course. Our work had reached a critical point. Through our analysis, we had identified a pattern in the forged communications, a particular style of phrasing, and a certain set of recurring errors that suggested a single mind behind the conspiracy. More importantly, we had traced several of the false dispatches back to a node in the intelligence network that should have been beyond reproach, the office of Sir Reginald Blackwood, the War Office's chief cryptographer. And then there was the matter of Sir Reginald Blackwood. I had suspected him for weeks, ever since we had traced the errors in the forged dispatches to their source. The particular phrasing, the specific cipher variations, the choice of paper and ink, they all pointed towards someone with access to the highest levels of military intelligence. And Blackwood, as the War Office's chief cryptographer, had access to everything. But suspicion was not proof, and the coincidence of his connection to my father gnawed at me, making me wonder if I was seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. It was Lord Harcourt who helped me separate my emotions from my analysis. We sat together one evening, reviewing all the evidence we had gathered, and he walked me through it, piece by piece, with the same methodical patience he would have applied to planning a military campaign. Set aside your personal history, he said. Forget that this man destroyed your father. Look only at the facts. Where do they lead? They led to Blackwood. Every thread, every clue, every pattern converged on the same point. It was not my grief seeking a target. It was the truth, plain and undeniable. Blackwood had been my father's colleague. Blackwood had been the one to accuse my father of treason. When I had first made the connection, I had nearly collapsed from the shock of it. Lord Harcourt had steadied me, his hands warm and strong on my shoulders, and he had listened without interruption as I told him everything I knew about Blackwood and my father, about the accusation and the disgrace and the death that had followed. Then he had said, "We will find the proof. We will expose him, and we will clear your father's name." It was the most beautiful promise anyone had ever made me. But exposing Blackwood would not be easy. He was a man of considerable power and influence, with connections throughout the government and the military. We could not simply accuse him without evidence, not when the accusation would come from a disgraced professor's daughter and a general whose own life had been threatened by the conspiracy. We needed proof, irrefutable proof, and obtaining it would require a level of cunning and risk that made me nervous to contemplate. Lord Harcourt's plan was audacious. He proposed to host a grand ball at Thornwood Hall, ostensibly to celebrate his return to England and to honor his military colleagues. In reality, the ball would serve as bait. We would invite Blackwood among the guests and use the occasion to search his belongings for evidence, while simultaneously feeding him false information to see if it appeared in any subsequent forged dispatches. It was a dangerous game, but Lord Harcourt was confident in our ability to play it. I was somewhat less confident, but I trusted him more than I had ever trusted anyone, and so I agreed to the plan. The ball was scheduled for the first week of February. In the weeks leading up to it, I was transformed. Mrs. Brennan, acting on Lord Harcourt's instructions, engaged a seamstress from London to create a wardrobe appropriate for what she delicately termed my new position. I was fitted for gowns and slippers and gloves. My hair was styled in the latest fashion, and I was drilled on the etiquette of high society until I could navigate a ballroom without committing any unforgivable faux pas. The seamstress, a sharp-eyed woman named Madame Fontaine, clucked her tongue as she took my measurements. "You have good bones," she declared. "Strong shoulders, a waist that needs no corset to be admired. We will make you a vision, Miss Ashford. A vision that will silence every gossip in London." I submitted to her ministrations with a mix of fascination and terror. I had never owned a gown that was not made of sturdy, practical fabric. I had never worn jewels more elaborate than my mother's simple pearl earrings. The world Madame Fontaine was preparing me to enter was as foreign to me as the surface of the moon. But I would not fail. I could not fail. Too much depended on my ability to play this role convincingly. The dancing lessons were perhaps the most challenging aspect of my transformation. A dance master was brought from London, a fussy man with perfectly powdered hair and an accent that seemed to shift between French and English depending on his mood. He taught me the quadrille, the cotillion, the minuet, and the waltz, rapping my ankles with a thin cane whenever I made a misstep. "You must be lighter, Miss Ashford," he would say, his tone suggesting that lightness was a moral failing I had yet to overcome. "You move like a housemaid carrying linens." I gritted my teeth and tried again, and again, and again. By the end of the second week, even the exacting dance master admitted that I had made acceptable progress. Through it all, Lord Harcourt watched. He attended my dancing lessons, offering corrections when I stumbled. He reviewed my wardrobe choices, approving some, and rejecting others with a decisiveness that suggested he had given considerable thought to the matter. He even coached me on conversation, teaching me the art of saying nothing of substance while appearing to say a great deal. "You will be magnificent," he said one evening as we practiced a waltz in the empty ballroom. "They will never suspect what you truly are." "And what am I truly?" I asked, breathless from the dance and from his proximity. He pulled me closer than the dance required, his hand warm against the small of my back. "You are a weapon," he said softly, "the most dangerous kind, one that looks like a flower." I laughed, though the sound came out more like a gasp. "I do not feel like a weapon. I feel like a fraud." "Then you are playing your part perfectly." He released me and stepped back, his expression shifting to something more businesslike. "We should rest. The ball is only 3 days away." The night of the ball arrived with a snowstorm that seemed determined to prevent anyone from attending. But the aristocracy of England was not so easily deterred by mere weather, and by 8 o'clock the ballroom of Thornwood Hall was filled with glittering guests, their jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I stood in the shadows near the entrance, watching the spectacle and trying to calm my racing heart. The gown I wore was the finest I had ever owned, a confection of deep blue silk that matched my eyes, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice and hem. My hair had been swept up and adorned with tiny crystals that sparkled when I moved. I looked, according to Mrs. Brennan, like a lady. I did not feel like a lady. I felt like an imposter, a servant girl playing dress-up, waiting for someone to see through my disguise and expose me for what I truly was. Miss Ashford. I turned to find Lord Harcourt standing behind me, resplendent in his military uniform, his medals gleaming against the dark fabric. His gray eyes swept over me from head to toe, and something in his expression made my breath catch. "You look," he paused, searching for words. "You look beautiful." I felt my cheeks flame. "Thank you, my lord. You are too kind." "I am never kind," he said. "You know that." He offered me his arm. "Come, it is time to make our entrance." I hesitated. "My lord, are you certain this is wise? If we appear together, people will talk. People always talk. Let them." He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "I find that I no longer care what they say. Do you?" I looked into his eyes and saw something there that made my heart soar despite my fear. "No," I said, "I do not care either." I took his arm, and together we descended the stairs into the ballroom. The reaction was everything Lord Harcourt had predicted. Conversation died as we passed, only to resume in whispers as soon as we were out of earshot. Ladies hid their mouths behind fans, their eyes wide with shock and speculation. Gentlemen exchanged knowing glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. But I held my head high and kept my smile in place, drawing on every lesson I had learned in the past weeks. I was not a servant tonight. I was Lord Harcourt's guest, his consultant, well, whatever I was to him. And I would not let the judgment of strangers diminish me. The evening proceeded according to plan. Lord Harcourt introduced me to various guests as his assistant in certain confidential matters. A vague description that did nothing to quell the speculation, but at least provided a veneer of respectability. I danced and conversed and laughed, all while keeping one eye on the door, waiting for the arrival of the man we had come to trap. Sir Reginald Blackwood arrived at 9:30, and I recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed since our last encounter. He was older now, his hair gone gray and his face lined with age, but he still had the same cold eyes, the same thin-lipped smile that I remembered from my father's funeral. He had not come to offer condolences, of course. He had come to gloat. The memory of that day flooded back to me with painful clarity. My mother, thin and pale in her mourning dress, standing by my father's grave while the rain fell in sheets. The few mourners who had dared to attend, huddled under umbrellas, their faces filled with pity and discomfort. And Blackwood, standing apart from the others, watching the proceedings with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. He had destroyed my father. He had murdered him as surely as if he had plunged a knife into his heart. And now he was here, in this glittering ballroom, mingling with the elite of English society as though he had every right to stand among them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run across the room and tear the smug expression from his face with my bare hands. I wanted to denounce him before everyone, to shout the truth until the rafters shook with the force of my fury. But I did not. I could not. We needed proof, and getting that proof required patience. Seeing him again awakened a fury in me that I had thought long buried. I wanted to stride across the ballroom and denounce him in front of everyone. I wanted to scream the truth until the rafters shook with the force of my rage. But I did not. I could not. We needed proof, and getting that proof required patience. Lord Harcourt materialized at my side, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. "Steady," he murmured. "Remember the plan." I drew a deep breath and forced myself to relax. The plan. Yes, we had a plan. The plan involved me engaging Blackwood in conversation, while Lord Harcourt searched the guest chambers upstairs, where Blackwood's belongings had been taken upon his arrival. I was to keep him occupied for at least 30 minutes, long enough for Lord Harcourt to find the evidence we needed. It was a simple plan. That did not make it any less terrifying. I approached Blackwood with a smile that felt like a mask stretched too tight across my face. "Sir Reginald," I said, using the voice I had practiced in front of the mirror, smooth and confident and revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. "I do not believe we have been introduced. I am Miss Ashford." The name registered. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw. For a moment, I thought he might refuse to acknowledge me, might turn away and pretend he had not heard. But he was a man who valued appearances above all else, and refusing to speak to Lord Harcourt's guest would have drawn exactly the kind of attention he could not afford. His recovery was admirable, and within a heartbeat, he had composed himself into an expression of polite interest. "Miss Ashford?" he said smoothly. "A pleasure." He took my hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that made my skin crawl. His lips were dry and cold, and I had to resist the urge to snatch my hand back and wipe it on my gown. "I knew your father, once upon a time. A tragedy, what happened to him. Indeed." I withdrew my hand as quickly as politeness allowed. "I understand you were colleagues at Cambridge." "For a time, yes. He was a brilliant man, if somewhat. He paused, choosing his words with care, somewhat careless in his associations. The insult was veiled but unmistakable. I let it pass, though it cost me considerable effort. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, are you enjoying the ball? Lord Harcourt has spared no expense. It is certainly impressive." Blackwood accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant and took a sip. "Though I confess I am curious about the guest of honor. I was not aware that Lord Harcourt had any particular lady in his life." I smiled sweetly. "Lord Harcourt is a private man. He does not share his personal affairs with the world. Clearly not." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet here you are, on his arm, in his home, wearing what I suspect is a rather expensive gown. One might draw certain conclusions." "One might," I agreed. "But one would be wise to ensure those conclusions are accurate before speaking them aloud." I met his gaze steadily. "I am Lord Harcourt's assistant in matters of military intelligence. My presence here is strictly professional." Blackwood's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before he could suppress it. "Military intelligence? How unusual. And what qualifies you for such work, if I may ask?" "I have certain skills with languages and ciphers," I said, "a talent inherited from my father." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. Blackwood studied me with new intensity, his cold eyes calculating and reassessing. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind, could almost feel him wondering how much I knew, how much I suspected, how much of a threat I might pose. "Fascinating," he said at last. "And tell me, Miss Ashford, in your work with Lord Harcourt, have you encountered anything, shall we say, unusual?" I tilted my head as though considering the question. "Unusual how, Sir Reginald? Military communications are full of unusual content. I meant unusual in terms of," he lowered his voice, "authenticity. There have been rumors of forged dispatches circulating through certain channels. Quite sophisticated forgeries, I understand, the sort that would require considerable expertise to produce or to detect." My heart was racing, but I kept my voice light. "How intriguing. I have heard nothing of such forgeries. But then, I am merely an assistant. Lord Harcourt does not share everything with me." "Of course not." Blackwood smiled, and there was something reptilian in the expression. "Well, if you should hear anything, do let me know. The War Office takes such matters very seriously. I shall certainly keep that in mind." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, a dance of words and implications that left me exhausted but strangely exhilarated. Blackwood was probing, trying to determine how much I knew, but I gave him nothing. I deflected and misdirected and smiled my false smile, and all the while I could feel the clock ticking, counting down the minutes until Lord Harcourt would return with the proof we needed. He appeared at my side exactly 32 minutes after leaving, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleaming with triumph. I felt my heart leap at the sight of him, though whether from relief at his safe return or something deeper I could not have said. "Sir Reginald," he said smoothly, "I see you have met my invaluable assistant. I do hope she has been entertaining you." "Most entertaining," Blackwood replied. His voice was smooth as ever, but I could see a new wariness in his eyes, a calculation that had not been there before. He was wondering what I knew. He was wondering what I had told Lord Harcourt. He was wondering, perhaps for the first time, if his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. Miss Ashford is a fascinating conversationalist. He bowed to me. "If you will excuse me, I believe I see an old friend across the room." He departed, and Lord Harcourt drew me aside, his hand warm on my elbow. The touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "Did you find it?" I whispered. "Everything we need," he murmured back. "Letters, cipher keys, drafts of the forgeries." He was either arrogant or foolish enough to bring evidence of his treachery into my home. "What do we do now?" "Now," he said. his gray eyes meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. We dance. I did not understand at first, but then the orchestra struck up a waltz, and Lord Harcourt was leading me onto the floor, his arm around my waist, his hand clasping mine, and suddenly nothing else mattered. The music swelled around us, violins and cellos weaving a melody that seemed to speak directly to my heart. The other dancers moved past us in a blur of silk and satin, their faces indistinct, their conversations muted. There was only Sebastian, his gray eyes holding mine, his hand warm against my waist, leading me through the steps with the same confident authority he brought to everything he did. I had danced with the dance master. I had practiced these steps countless times in the empty ballroom. But this was different. This was not practice. This was a declaration, made before all the assembled guests, that whatever existed between us was more than professional courtesy. And I found that I did not care who saw. I did not care what they thought. I cared only about the man in my arms, the man who had seen me when no one else had, who had valued me when the world dismissed me. We moved through the steps as though we had danced together 1,000 times, our bodies moving in perfect synchronicity, our eyes locked on each other. The other guests faded into a blur of color and light, their whispers and stares becoming meaningless static. There was only the music and the motion and the man holding me, looking at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world. "Rosalind," he said softly, "when this is over, when Blackwood has been brought to justice and your father's name has been cleared, there is something I wish to discuss with you." My heart stuttered. "And what is that, my lord?" "Sebastian," he corrected. "When we are alone, when there is no one to hear, I would have you call me Sebastian." Sebastian. The name felt like a secret on my tongue, a treasure I had been given permission to hold. "What did you wish to discuss, Sebastian?" His hand tightened on my waist. "Us," he said simply. "What we are to each other, what we might become." I could not breathe. "Are you certain? The scandal, the difference in our stations, your reputation?" "I am certain of nothing except that I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He pulled me closer. "Propriety be damned. I spent 17 years convinced that I would never feel anything for another woman as long as I lived. I was wrong. You have taught me that I was wrong. Sebastian." "Do not answer now," he said. "Take whatever time you need. But know that my feelings will not change, whether you give me your answer tomorrow or a year from now." The waltz ended and we separated, returning to our respective roles as host and assistant. But something had shifted between us, something profound and irreversible. I carried his words with me for the rest of the evening, like a flame burning in my chest, warming me against the cold stares of the aristocrats who could not understand what they were witnessing. Blackwood was arrested 2 days later. The morning was cold and clear, the snow that had fallen during the ball having given way to brilliant winter sunshine that made everything sparkle like diamonds. Lord Harcourt had sent word to the proper authorities the previous evening, and they had dispatched a detail of soldiers to take Blackwood into custody. I watched from the window of the east wing as they led him away. He was struggling, his face contorted with rage, his voice carrying across the courtyard even though I could not make out the words. He had been so confident, so secure in his position, so certain that his crimes would never be discovered. The sight of his downfall should have brought me joy. Instead, I felt only a strange hollowness, a sense that something had ended that could never be recovered. Lord Harcourt, true to his word, had presented the evidence to the appropriate authorities, evidence that proved beyond any doubt that Blackwood had been the mastermind behind the conspiracy. The forged dispatches, the attempts on Lord Harcourt's life, even the original betrayal of my father, all of it traced back to Blackwood, driven by a toxic combination of greed and jealousy that had festered for decades. The trial was swift and merciless. Blackwood attempted to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to hang. During the trial, the full extent of his treachery was revealed. He had been working with French agents for nearly a decade, selling military secrets in exchange for gold and the promise of a position in Napoleon's government once England was conquered. He had framed my father to eliminate a rival who was beginning to suspect him. He had orchestrated the deaths of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of British soldiers through his forged dispatches and compromised intelligence. The spectators in the gallery gasped and whispered as each new revelation emerged. The newspapers printed special editions, their headlines screaming of betrayal and treason. Blackwood's name became synonymous with treachery, his reputation destroyed as thoroughly as he had destroyed my father's. I did not attend the execution. I found that I did not need to. The satisfaction of seeing justice done was enough. The knowledge that my father's name would finally be restored, that the truth had emerged from the shadows where it had been buried for so long. In the weeks that followed, Lord Harcourt, Sebastian, was as good as his word. He petitioned the Crown to officially exonerate Thomas Ashford, and the petition was granted. My father's reputation was restored, his legacy rehabilitated, his contributions to England's security acknowledged and honored. I received the official document on a grey February morning, delivered by a courier from London who seemed unaware of the magnitude of what he carried. The seal of the Crown gleamed on the parchment, the words formal and precise, but their meaning was anything but cold. Thomas Ashford, Professor of Linguistics, is hereby declared innocent of all charges of treason and espionage. His loyal service to the Crown is recognized and honored. Let his name be restored to good standing, and let his memory be honored by all who knew him. I wept when I read those words. I wept as I had not wept since my father's funeral, great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my heart. Sebastian held me through it, saying nothing, simply offering the comfort of his presence while I released years of grief and anger and helpless fury. When the storm had passed, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight I had carried for so long, the burden of being the daughter of a supposed traitor, was finally lifted. I could walk through the world with my head held high, no longer fearing that someone would discover my past and use it against me. My father was innocent. Everyone knew it now. And that knowledge was worth more to me than all the titles and fortunes in England. And then there was the matter of us. I had expected resistance. I had expected objections from society, from the servants, from Sebastian's military colleagues, from everyone who believed that a man of his station had no business forming an attachment to a woman of mine. There was resistance. There were objections. But Sebastian met everyone with the same implacable determination he brought to the battlefield. He was the general, after all. He was accustomed to winning. The whispers followed us everywhere. A tradesman's daughter, they said, a servant, a nobody with delusions of grandeur, who had somehow bewitched the great Lord Harcourt. I heard the murmurs at the few social events we attended together, saw the sidelong glances and the raised eyebrows. But Sebastian never wavered. He stood beside me at every function, his hand warm on the small of my back, his gray eyes daring anyone to challenge our relationship. And slowly, gradually, the whispers began to fade. It helped that I had played a crucial role in exposing Blackwood. The newspapers, ever hungry for a romantic angle, had latched onto the story of the brave young woman who had saved the general's life. They painted me as a heroine, a brilliant cipher breaker who had risked everything to serve her country. It was an exaggeration, of course, but it served our purposes admirably. And then there was my father's exoneration. When the Crown officially declared Thomas Ashford innocent of all charges, posthumously restoring his reputation and his legacy, even the most determined gossips found it difficult to look down upon me. I was no longer the daughter of a traitor. I was the daughter of a patriot who had been martyred by the very villain who had threatened the life of England's most celebrated general. We married in the spring, in the chapel at Thornwood Hall, with the daffodils blooming in the gardens and the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Mrs. Brennan wept throughout the ceremony. The few guests who attended looked on with expressions ranging from bewilderment to cautious approval. Among those guests were several of Sebastian's military colleagues who had worked with us to expose Blackwood, men who had come to respect my abilities despite their initial skepticism. There was Colonel Ashworth, who had doubted me at first but had become one of my strongest advocates after I deciphered a message that saved 3 of his men from an ambush. There was Major Pemberton, who still looked at me with something like wonder, as though he could not quite believe that a woman could possess the skills I had demonstrated. And there was Mrs. Brennan's sister, who had traveled from Bristol to witness the wedding, her face reflecting her amazement at how far her sister's former charge had risen. My mother's pearl earrings adorned my ears, and I wore a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, a gift he had pressed into my hands the night before the wedding with a tenderness that still made my heart ache to remember. "You should have these," he had said. "She would have wanted you to have them. She would have loved you, Rosalind, just as I love you." I wore a gown of ivory silk and carried a bouquet of white roses, and when Sebastian took my hand and spoke his vows, his gray eyes were bright with something I had never thought to see there: joy. He kissed me then, in front of the altar and the witnesses and God himself, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges we would face them together. That was 8 months ago. I am writing this now in the study that was once Sebastian's alone, but has become ours, seated at the desk where I first discovered the forged dispatch that changed the course of both our lives. The fire is burning low, and outside the window, snow is falling again, blanketing Thornwood Hall in white silence. The room has changed since those early days when I crept in as a servant to deliver correspondence. Sebastian had new bookshelves built to accommodate my father's collection, which had been recovered from storage and restored to its former glory. My own desk sits near the window, cluttered with papers and the cipher keys I still study in my spare time. A portrait of my parents now hangs beside the miniature of Catherine, the 2 images keeping each other company in the flickering firelight. Sebastian is reading in the chair across from me a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that he pretends to find merely acceptable, but that I know he loves. Every so often, he looks up and catches my eye, and we share a smile that requires no words. These small moments of connection have become the foundation of our life together, the quiet intimacy that sustains us through the demands of his military work and my ongoing contributions to the intelligence efforts. I have learned many things since that December evening, when I broke all the rules of my station to save the life of a man I loved without knowing it. I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I have learned that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people. I have learned that the past does not have to define the future, that redemption is possible, that second chances are real. And I have learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is refuse to be invisible any longer. I set down my pen and look across the room at my husband, at the man who saw me when no one else did, who valued me when the world dismissed me, who gave me a place at his side and in his heart. The war with France continues, and Sebastian still serves his country, though now he does so from the safety of Thornwood Hall, advising Wellington through correspondence rather than leading charges on the battlefield. His days of active combat are behind him, a decision he made shortly after our wedding. "I cannot risk leaving you alone," he had said when I asked him why. "I have lost too much already. I will not lose you too." Sometimes late at night, he still has nightmares. He wakes trembling, his gray eyes haunted by memories of battles and bloodshed, of men who died under his command, of decisions that cost lives even as they won victories. On those nights, I hold him close and whisper words of comfort until the trembling stops, until the ghosts retreat, until he can sleep peacefully once more. And sometimes I have nightmares too. I dream of Blackwood's cold eyes, of my father's grave, of the moment when I pushed open those dining room doors, knowing that my life would never be the same. On those nights, Sebastian holds me, his arms strong and sure, his voice a low rumble against my ear as he reminds me that I am safe, that I am loved, that the past cannot hurt me anymore. We have built a life together, Sebastian and I, a life that neither of us ever expected to have. We work together on matters of military intelligence, my skills with ciphers proving invaluable to the war effort. We read together in the evenings, debating poetry and philosophy, with the same intensity we once brought to analyzing forged dispatches. We walk the grounds of Thornwood Hall on fine days, watching the seasons change, planning for a future that stretches before us like an unmarked map. It is not the life I imagined for myself when I was a young girl learning languages at my father's knee. It is not the life I imagined when I became a servant, learning to be invisible, learning to survive in a world that had no place for me. It is better. It is immeasurably, impossibly better. Sebastian, I say softly. He looks up from his book. Yes, my darling. I love you. The words are simple, but his smile tells me they are everything. And I love you, he replies, more than all the words in all the books in this library, more than I knew it was possible to love. He rises and comes to me, taking my hand and drawing me to my feet. He pulls me into his arms, and I rest my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the snow continues to fall. Inside, the fire crackles and the candles flicker, and the silence wraps around us like a blanket. I think of the girl I was a year ago, invisible and afraid, and so certain that she would never be anything more than a shadow in someone else's life. I think of how far I have come, how much I have survived, how much I have gained. I think of my father, who taught me to see patterns where others saw only chaos. I think of my mother, whose love sustained me even after she was gone. I think of all the choices I made that led me to this moment, this room, this man's arms. And I know, with a certainty that goes beyond reason, that this is exactly where I was always meant to be. The path was not straight. The road was not easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, when the future looked so dark that I could not imagine any light at the end of it. But I kept going. I kept fighting. I kept believing that somewhere, somehow, there was a place in the world where I belonged, and I found it, not in a place, but in a person, not in a position, but in a partnership. Not in what I could do, but in who I could become when I stopped hiding and started living. Sebastian's arms tighten around me, and I feel his lips press against the top of my head. "Whatever are you thinking about so seriously?" he murmurs. I smile against his chest. The past, the future. How grateful I am that you saw me when no one else did. He pulls back just enough to tilt my chin up, to look into my eyes with that intensity that still takes my breath away, even after all these months. "I did not see you," he says. "You were always there. I was simply the first one wise enough to look." And then he kisses me, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I know that whatever comes next, we will face it together. In his arms, in this house. In this life we have built together from the ruins of our separate pasts. Home. I am finally, impossibly, wonderfully home.